You know the smell. That faintly metallic, slightly sweet, almost waxy scent that drifts out of a fast food kitchen at 3 in the afternoon when the fryer oil has been working since breakfast. It clings to your hair. It settles into the fibers of your jacket. Hours later, you can still catch a ghost of it on your sleeve, that trace of oil that has been heated and reheated until something about its character has shifted into something the human nose has learned to flag as not quite right. Most of us have stopped noticing. We've grown up inside that smell. But here's the disruption. That smell isn't an accident, and it isn't just old grease. It is the chemical signature of a category of oils that, depending on which scientist you ask this week, is either the cornerstone of modern heart-healthy eating or one of the most quietly contested ingredients in the human diet. And almost nobody is telling you the full story of how it got into nearly every package on the shelf. Let's talk about what's actually in your kitchen, your pantry, your favorite restaurant's deep fryer, and quite possibly the formula you fed your baby. Because seed oils, sometimes called industrial seed oils or vegetable oils, have become so ubiquitous in the modern food supply that researchers have called the shift one of the largest uncontrolled nutritional experiments in human history. They appear in salad dressings, in crackers, in granola bars, in the bread at the sandwich shop, in the rotisserie chicken at the grocery store, in coffee creamers, in protein bars, in the oil that coats your tortilla chips, in the spray that releases your muffins from the pan, in the broth that simmers your soup. The average person in a high-income country today consumes vastly more of these oils than any human ate at any point in the previous several 100,000 years, and that change happened, by historical standards, almost overnight. And here's what makes this complicated. These oils were sold to the public for decades as the heart-healthy alternative, the thing your doctor told your parents to switch to. The reason butter got pushed to the back of the refrigerator. They came wrapped in language about plant-based goodness, in commercials with smiling families and golden wheat fields, in food pyramids and the small green hearts on the front of the box. What they actually are, when you pull back the marketing, is something most consumers have never been shown. They are industrial extracts, byproducts of an agriculture system that needed somewhere to put the oil pressed and chemically dissolved out of cotton seeds, soybeans, corn germ, and the seeds of crops bred primarily for other purposes. The story of how those byproducts became the centerpiece of the American plate is not a story of nutrition science leading the way. It's a story in large part of industrial economics, regulatory loopholes, and a remarkably effective marketing campaign that ran for the better part of a century. So here's what I want to do in this video. I want to walk you through what isn't being told. Not the panicked version, not the everything will kill you version, but the honest gaps. How these oils are actually made, step by step, in plants you've never seen. What the omega ratios in the modern diet actually look like compared to 100 years ago. What recent reanalyses of old clinical trials have surfaced that nobody talks about on the news, where the funding for the reassuring studies tends to come from, and what the dissenting researchers, the ones publishing in peer-reviewed journals right now, are quietly trying to get the rest of the field to consider. Before we go further, if you've ever stood in a grocery aisle squinting at an ingredient label trying to figure out what soybean oil is doing in your bread, do me one small favor and let the algorithm know this conversation matters to you. Because the more people who get information that lets them ask their own questions, the harder it gets for any single industry to control what reaches their kitchen. That's it. No big ask. Let's get into it. To understand seed oils, you have to start in the late 19th century in the cotton fields of the American South. Cotton was a massive industry, and after the fiber was pulled off, what remained was an enormous waste product, mountains of cotton seeds that farmers used to dump or burn. Some of it went to fertilizer, some of it went to cattle feed, until people noticed the cattle weren't doing well on it. The seeds contained an oil that, in raw form, was inedible to humans. Dark, foul-tasting, slightly toxic because of a compound called gossypol. For decades, this seed oil had no real market. It was a problem looking for a solution. Then chemists figured out how to refine it, deodorize it, and bleach it into something pale and bland, and an enterprising company began selling it as a replacement for lard, the animal fat that, until that moment, had been the standard cooking grease in nearly every American household. The product was called Crisco, and it hit shelves in 1911. The marketing was relentless. Cookbooks were given away free if they featured Crisco recipes. Home economics teachers were trained on its use. An industrial waste stream had become a household staple, and the template for the next century was set. Soybean oil followed a similar arc. After the Second World War, the United States had built enormous soybean production capacity, partly for industrial uses, partly for animal feed. The oil that came out of the crushing process was, again, a byproduct that needed a market. Through a combination of subsidies, food industry adoption, and the cardiovascular health messaging emerging in the 1960s and 1970s, soybean oil rose to become the single most consumed source of dietary fat in the United States, accounting, by some estimates, for more than half of all added fats in the American diet. Corn oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, canola oil, which is a Canadian-developed cultivar of rapeseed, bred to lower its naturally high erucic acid content. Grapeseed, oil, rice, bran oil, all came up through similar industrial pathways. None were oils. Humans had been pressing in meaningful quantity for most of recorded history. They became dietary fixtures because the agricultural and chemical infrastructure made them cheap, shelf-stable, and abundant, and because the prevailing nutrition narrative of the late 20th century, which emphasized lowering saturated fat intake, gave them a jaedo, marketing tailwind that animal fats simply could not match. Now, here's where the story usually skips over something important. How are these oils actually made? Because when most people picture vegetable oil, they picture something like olive oil, a fruit getting pressed, the oil running out, getting bottled. That is not how the seed oils on your shelf are typically produced. The standard industrial process starts with seeds being cleaned, cracked, heated, and then sent through what's called a screw press, which extracts a portion of the oil mechanically. But pressing alone leaves a significant amount of oil locked inside the seed material, and to get it out, the industry uses a chemical solvent. The most common solvent is hexane, a petroleum-derived hydrocarbon that effectively dissolves the remaining oil out of the seed meal. The mixture is then heated to evaporate the hexane off, and trace residues are permitted under regulatory limits in the finished product, with the food industry maintaining that those residues fall well within safety thresholds, while critics, including some published toxicologists, have raised questions about cumulative exposure. Across a food supply where hexane-extracted oils appear in dozens of daily products. After extraction, the crude oil is dark, smelly, and full of compounds that consumers would reject on sight. So it goes through a multi-step refining process. First, degumming, which uses water or acid to remove phospholipids. Then, neutralization, which uses sodium hydroxide, a strong base, to strip out free fatty acids. Then, bleaching, which passes the oil through clays or activated carbon to remove pigments and some oxidation products. Then, deodorization, which heats the oil to temperatures often in excess of 400 degrees Fahrenheit under vacuum to drive off the volatile compounds responsible for the smell and taste of the original seed. By the time the oil emerges, it is pale, nearly flavorless, and chemically, a quite different substance from what came out of the seed. It also, according to research published in journals like Food Chemistry and the Journal of the American Oil Chemists Society, contains measurable quantities of compounds that didn't exist in the original raw oil. Trans fats can form during the high-heat deodorization step, often at low single-digit percentages that, until relatively recent labeling rule changes, were not required to appear on the nutrition facts panel because they fell under rounding thresholds. Lipid oxidation products, the breakdown molecules that form when polyunsaturated fats are exposed to heat and oxygen, are present at levels that vary by manufacturer and processing conditions and that have been the subject of ongoing scientific scrutiny. This brings us to the chemistry that sits at the heart of the entire debate. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are the dominant fat type in most seed oils, contain multiple double bonds in their molecular structure. Those double bonds are what makes them liquid at room temperature, and they're also what makes them chemically reactive. Heat, light, and oxygen can attack those double bonds and trigger a cascade called lipid peroxidation, which produces a long list of compounds with names like 4-hydroxynonenal, often shortened to HNE, malondialdehyde, often shortened to MDA, and a broader category researchers refer to as oxylipins. These compounds have been studied extensively in laboratory settings, and researchers including the late Gerald Lawrence, whose work appeared in journals like Advances in Nutrition, and Christopher Ramsden, whose investigative reanalyses of historical clinical trial data appeared in the BMJ, have argued that the prevailing dietary recommendations underestimated the importance of how these oils behave once they're heated, stored, and metabolized inside the human body. There's another piece of the puzzle that researchers have flagged. Across the 20th century, as seed oil consumption rose, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the average diet shifted dramatically. Omega-6 fats, which are abundant in most seed oils, and omega-3 fats, which come primarily from sources like fatty fish, flaxseed, walnuts, and grass-fed animal products, both play essential roles in human physiology. They are precursors to signaling molecules that influence inflammation, immune response, and cellular function. The two compete for some of the same enzymatic pathways. Estimates of the ancestral human diet, drawn from anthropological and biochemical studies, suggest the ratio likely sat somewhere between 1:1 and 4:1. Estimates of the contemporary Western diet place that ratio anywhere from 15:1 to as high as 20 or 25:1 in some populations, driven overwhelmingly by the rise of seed oils. The research community has not reached full consensus on what this means, but a substantial body of work, summarized in reviews by researchers like Artemis Simopoulos in journals like Biomedicine and Pharmacotherapy, has raised concerns that the imbalance may contribute to a chronic low-grade inflammatory environment that interacts with other features of the modern lifestyle, from sleep deprivation to ultra-processed food consumption to sedentary behavior. Now I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where the conversation gets contentious, and I owe you the other side. The American Heart Association, which has issued dietary guidance on fats for decades, continues to recommend replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, including those from seed oils, citing meta-analyses that show favorable effects on LDL cholesterol levels and on certain cardiovascular outcomes. Major reviews published in journals like Circulation and the Cochrane Database have, in their author summaries, defended the cardiovascular benefits of swapping animal fats for vegetable oils. Some of the most cited research in nutritional epidemiology supports the position that seed oils, in the context of an otherwise reasonable diet, do not appear to elevate disease risk and may, in some analyses, lower it. So when you hear someone tell you the science is settled in either direction, That person is probably not reading the literature carefully. The honest answer is that mainstream cardiology guidance still leans toward polyunsaturated fats over saturated fats for cardiovascular outcomes, and that a sizable and growing minority of researchers has begun raising published questions about whether that guidance accounts adequately for the form, processing, oxidation status, and overall food matrix in which those oils are consumed. Both of those things are true at the same time. Take a breath with me on that, because the temptation in a topic like this is to pick a tribe. Resist it. Stay curious. Where the picture has gotten genuinely interesting in recent years is in the reanalyses of old clinical trials whose original data, in some cases, had been sitting in storage for decades. The most discussed of these is the reanalysis of the Sydney Diet Heart Study, published in the BMJ in 2013, in which researchers led by Christopher Ramsden located unpublished raw data from a 1960s and 1970s trial that had replaced saturated fat in participants' diets with safflower oil, a high omega-6 seed oil. The reanalysis found that the safflower oil group, despite achieving the expected reductions in serum cholesterol, experienced higher rates of cardiovascular and all-cause mortality than the control group. A similar reanalysis of the Minnesota coronary experiment, published in the BMJ in 2016 by the same research group, surfaced comparable patterns. The studies have been debated, criticized, and defended in the peer-reviewed literature ever since, with cardiology and nutrition researchers landing in different places depending on how they weight the evidence. But the existence of the reanalyses and the reality that lowering cholesterol through seed oil substitution did not, in those trials, translate into the survival benefit the original researchers had expected has become a permanent fixture in the conversation that the dissenting voices keep returning to. There's another piece of the picture that gets less airtime than it should, and that's the funding pattern behind the reassuring research. Investigations published in journals like JAMA Internal Medicine and reporting in outlets like the Journal of the American Medical Association's news coverage have documented that a meaningful portion of nutrition research, including research that has shaped dietary guidelines, has historically received funding from food industry sources, including organizations representing seed oil producers, processed food manufacturers, and the broader agricultural commodity sector. This is not a secret, and it is not unique to seed oils. It is a structural feature of how nutrition science gets funded in the absence of robust public investment. But it does mean that when you see a headline announcing that vegetable oils are good for your heart, it is worth, as a media-literate consumer, scrolling to the funding disclosures at the bottom of the original paper. Sometimes those disclosures will tell you nothing alarming. Sometimes they will tell you the study was supported by a trade association whose members would suffer commercially if the conclusion went the other way. That doesn't automatically mean the science is wrong. It means the evidence has to be weighed with that context in view. The other place this conversation has surfaced recently, in a way that has dragged it out of nutrition journals and into the mainstream news, is in the political sphere. The Make America Healthy Again policy conversations associated with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his role as Secretary of Health and Human Services have included specific discussion of seed oils as a target for regulatory and public health attention, alongside ultra-processed foods, food dyes, and additives. There have been congressional hearings in 2024 and 2025 in which food industry executives have been questioned about the formulation of products marketed to children. I'm not here to tell you what to make of the politics of any of that. People can and will draw different conclusions about the messengers and the agendas. What I will tell you is that the underlying questions about how processed seed oils are manufactured, what their long-term effects might be, and why the regulatory and nutritional guidance has lagged behind the published research are legitimate questions that deserve a hearing on their own merits, regardless of who is asking them. Let me get personal for a moment. A few years ago, before I started looking at any of this seriously, I went through a stretch where I was eating what I would have called a healthy diet. Lots of grain bowls from the place around the corner, granola for breakfast, salads with the dressing that came in the little plastic cup, roasted vegetables but cooked, as I later realized, in oils I had never thought to ask about. I was tired in a way I couldn't explain. My joints felt creaky in the morning in a way that didn't match my age. I wasn't sick, exactly, but I wasn't well. On a whim, mostly. Because a friend was doing it, I spent 6 weeks cooking almost everything at home using olive oil, butter, and tallow. I didn't change anything else dramatically. Same protein, similar carb load, same exercise. Within about 3 weeks, the morning stiffness was gone, and the afternoon energy crash that I had been treating as a personality trait quietly disappeared. I am not telling you this is proof of anything. I am one person, and one person's experience is not science. But I will tell you, it was the experience that made me actually start reading the literature. And once you start reading, you can't quite unread. So let me name the products to watch for, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Restaurant fryer oil is the first and most obvious. Most fast food and casual dining establishments use a blend of canola, soybean, or what's labeled as vegetable oil, often held at high temperatures for extended periods, sometimes filtered and reused for days. The longer oil sits at fryer temperatures, the more lipid oxidation products accumulate. If the food you're eating tastes like the oil more than it tastes like the food, that's a signal worth noting. Packaged snacks are the second category. Crackers, chips, cookies, granola bars, breakfast bars, even many of the products marketed as healthy options at the natural food store will list sunflower oil, safflower oil, soybean oil, or canola oil somewhere on the ingredient panel. Salad dressings are the third. The bottled dressings on the supermarket shelf, almost without exception, list a seed oil as the primary fat, even when the front of the bottle says olive oil, often with a small amount of olive oil added for the label and the bulk of the volume coming from soybean or canola, mayonnaise, sauces, marinades, the tortillas, the pita bread, the pre-roasted nuts. Even infant formula has, for years, been formulated with vegetable oil blends as a source of polyunsaturated fats, and the long-term consequences of starting human nutrition on industrial PUFA blends from day one is, by the honest admission of researchers in the field, not something we have multi-generational data to fully evaluate. Quick pause. If this is opening your eyes the way it opened mine, hit subscribe, because the next investigations go into the categories right after this, and you don't want the algorithm to lose track of you mid-series. Now, I want to dwell for just a moment on what I think is the single most damning gap in the conversation as it's typically presented to the public. It is not the omega ratio. It is not the lipid peroxidation chemistry, important as those are. It is the manufacturing process itself, and the fact that almost no consumer has ever been shown what it looks like. If you were to walk into a soybean oil refinery, you would not see anything. That resembles the imagery the food industry uses to sell these oils. You would not see fields of wheat or smiling farmers or wooden presses. You would see industrial vats, steel piping, hexane recovery systems, deodorization columns running at temperatures that would scorch any food you put on them, bleaching clays, caustic neutralization tanks. You would see a chemical processing facility. The product that comes out the other end is then poured into bottles with green labels and leaves and the word natural printed in serif fonts, and it is sold to your grandmother as the heart-healthy choice. The disconnect between how these oils are made and how they are marketed is, In the assessment of an increasing number of researchers and journalists who have looked into it, the single largest gap in consumer awareness in the entire fats and oils category, you have been allowed, for 100 years, to picture one thing while consuming another. That is the gap. That is what nobody has been telling you. Not that seed oils will hurt you in any specific dose, because the honest answer is that the science is still being argued, but that you have been making decisions about your family's food without ever being shown what the food actually is, okay? Pivot with me. Because if you take seed oils out, or even cut them down significantly, you have to put something in their place. And the good news is, the alternatives are not exotic, are not expensive in the long run, and have been used by humans for thousands of years. Extra virgin olive oil is the workhorse. Look for oil from a single country of origin, ideally from a single producer, with a harvest date on the bottle, packaged in dark glass to protect it from light. The Mediterranean diet research, which has held up across multiple large studies, including PREDIMD, consistently points to extra virgin olive oil as a fat associated with favorable health outcomes. Use it for dressings, for low and medium heat cooking, for finishing dishes. Some of the older nervousness about cooking with olive oil at higher temperatures has been revisited by recent research, including studies out of Australia, suggesting that high-quality extra virgin olive oil is actually more stable under cooking heat than many of the seed oils it gets compared to, partly because of its antioxidant content. Grass-fed butter and ghee come next. Butter from cows that have spent meaningful time on pasture has a different fatty acid profile than conventionally raised butter, with higher levels of compounds like conjugated linoleic acid and a more favorable omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Ghee, which is butter with the milk solids removed, has a higher smoke point and longer shelf life and has been used in South Asian cooking for thousands of years. Coconut oil is a category of its own. It is high in saturated fats, predominantly medium-chain triglycerides, and it is extremely stable under heat. The mainstream nutrition guidance has been wary of it because of its effect on LDL cholesterol levels, but the research community is genuinely divided on whether the LDL elevation it produces translates into clinical risk in the way the cholesterol hypothesis has historically assumed. Use it where its flavor fits, knowing it sits inside an active scientific conversation. Beef tallow has come back into the mainstream conversation in a way that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. It is what McDonald's used to fry their fries in until 1990, when public health pressure pushed them to switch to vegetable oil, a transition many people now describe as a moment when the fries lost something specific. Tallow has a high smoke point, is shelf-stable, and contains saturated and monounsaturated fats predominantly. Source it from grass-finished cattle if you can. Avocado oil is increasingly popular and has a high smoke point, but the category has had genuine quality control problems, with a UC Davis study finding that a meaningful percentage of avocado oils on the market were either rancid or adulterated with cheaper oils. Look for cold-pressed, single origin in dark glass from a producer with a track record. For cooking temperatures, a rough framework. Low to medium heat sautés, extra virgin olive oil, butter. Medium to high heat, searing and roasting, ghee, tallow, coconut oil, high-quality avocado oil. Deep frying at home, tallow has historically been the gold standard. None of these are perfect for every situation, and your kitchen will probably end up with 3 or 4 of them. Humans have always rotated their fats by season and dish. Here's how to actually verify what's in your food. First, ingredient labels list ingredients in order of weight. If a seed oil is in the first 3 or 4 ingredients, it is a meaningful component of what you're eating. Second, watch for the catch-all phrase, vegetable oil. which legally permits the manufacturer to use whichever oil is cheapest at the time, often soybean, sometimes a blend. Third, watch for sunflower or safflower oil specifications labeled high oleic, which have been bred to contain more monounsaturated fat and less polyunsaturated fat, and which behave differently under heat than the standard varieties, though they are still a refined industrial product. Fourth, when ordering at restaurants, you can ask what oil the kitchen cooks in. Some servers will know, some won't. Some restaurants have started, in response to consumer pressure, advertising their oils prominently. A few high-end and clean-eating focused chains have made the switch to tallow, ghee, or olive oil and put it on the menu. Your asking, as a customer, is part of how that pressure builds. Fifth, for packaged foods, the cleaner the ingredient list and the shorter it is, the less likely you are to be eating a hidden seed oil carrier. And sixth, the single most reliable strategy is to cook at home with whole ingredients using fats you bought yourself. It is not glamorous advice, but it is the advice that actually moves the needle. You can spend hours optimizing every other variable in your diet, and if you eat out 5 times a week, the oils in those meals will dominate your intake regardless. Here is what I want you to do tonight, before this video falls out of your head and back into the noise. Walk to your pantry, open it, find 1 bottle of cooking oil, take it down, read the label, read the ingredient list, the country of origin if it's listed, the processing description if there is one, and the harvest or best by date. Notice what you actually own. Notice what you have been cooking with, possibly for years, without ever really looking. You don't have to throw anything away tonight. You don't have to overhaul your entire kitchen this week. You just have to look, because everything else, every choice you make about what comes into your home from this point forward, starts with looking honestly at what is already there. The seed oil debate is not going to be settled in this video, and it is not going to be settled in the news cycle next month. But what is in your hand right now is settleable. It is a bottle. It has a label. You can read it, and that single act of looking, repeated across every product you pick up from this week onward, is the beginning of the kind of food literacy that no industry, no marketing campaign, and no contested guideline can take away from you. The truth about seed oils is that the truth is still being written, and the most important seat at that table is yours, the consumer who pays attention. Take it, read the label, and I'll see you in the next investigation.